In the corner of an antique shop that smelled of old wood and forgotten memories, stood a magnificent grandfather clock that had been waiting for over 40 years to find its true owner. The clock was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved mahogany wood adorned with intricate details of birds and flowering vines, brass mechanisms that gleamed despite their age, and a face painted with celestial scenes that seemed to shift depending on the light. But what made this clock truly extraordinary was invisible to most people. It would only chime for those who possessed genuinely kind hearts. The clock had been created in 1897 by a master clockmaker named Wilhelm who had lost his young daughter to illness and wanted to create something that would honor her memory. His daughter had possessed the rare gift of seeing the goodness in everyone, even in people whom society had dismissed as cruel or selfish. Wilhelm designed the clock to operate on a principle his daughter had taught him, that true kindness was not about grand gestures or public displays, but about the quiet, consistent choices people made when nobody was watching. The clock's mechanism was unlike any other timepiece ever created. It contained not just gears and springs, but what Wilhelm called heart resonators, tiny crystalline structures that could detect the genuine intentions behind human actions. The clock didn't measure kindness by how much money someone donated to charity or how many volunteer hours they logged, but by the authenticity of compassion in their everyday moments. For decades, the grandfather clock had passed through various antique shops and estate sales, remaining stubbornly silent for every potential buyer. Wealthy collectors who wanted it as a status symbol would wind it carefully and wait for its famous chimes, only to hear nothing but the soft ticking of its mechanisms. People who purchased it hoping its value would increase found themselves owning an impressive but mysteriously mute piece of furniture. The clock's silence wasn't punishment or judgment, it was simply a reflection of truth. The heart resonators could detect when kindness was performative rather than genuine, when generosity came from a desire for recognition rather than authentic care for others, when patience was practiced as a strategy rather than flowing naturally from compassion. Everything changed when Elena, a middle school teacher with a modest salary and an even more modest apartment, walked into the antique shop looking for a birthday gift for her elderly neighbor. She wasn't shopping for herself. She could barely afford the small items in the shop's discount section. But as she passed the grandfather clock, she paused and gently touched its carved wood, admiring the artistry with genuine appreciation for the craftsman's skill and dedication. The moment Elena's hand made contact with the clock, something miraculous happened. The clock began to chime. Not the harsh, mechanical sound of ordinary timepieces, but a melody so beautiful and warm it seemed to contain every act of kindness that had ever been performed in the world. The chimes filled the shop with golden light that appeared to emanate from the clock itself, and everyone present felt an inexplicable sense of peace and hope. The shop owner, who had been trying to sell the clock for 15 years, stood in stunned silence. Elena pulled her hand back quickly, embarrassed by the attention, but the clock continued chiming its celestial melody, clearly indicating that it had finally found the person it had been waiting for. "That clock has never made a sound for anyone," the shop owner said, his voice filled with wonder. "According to the legend, it only chimes for people with truly kind hearts. I always thought it was just a story to justify its high price, but I've never heard it make any sound until now." Elena protested that she couldn't possibly afford such an obviously valuable antique, but the shop owner insisted she take it. "The clock has chosen you," he said simply. "I've been its temporary keeper, but you're meant to be its true owner. Besides, I have the feeling that this clock has purposes beyond just telling time." Elena brought the grandfather clock to her small apartment, where it became the centerpiece of her living room. She soon discovered that the clock's chiming had patterns and meanings that went far beyond simply marking hours. It would chime softly when one of her students was struggling emotionally and needed extra support, giving Elena a subtle alert to check in with that child. It would ring with particular warmth when she was making decisions that aligned with her values, even when those decisions were difficult or unpopular. But the clock's most remarkable quality revealed itself gradually: it had the power to inspire kindness in others simply through its presence. Students who visited Elena's apartment for tutoring sessions would leave feeling more compassionate and patient. Neighbors who stopped by for tea would find themselves motivated to perform small acts of kindness in their own lives. The clock seemed to radiate an energy that reminded people of their own capacity for goodness. The clock's chimes became a source of guidance for Elena in unexpected ways. When she was considering whether to spend her limited savings helping a student's family pay for medical treatment, the clock chimed with such pure, clear tones that she knew the decision was right, even though it meant delaying her own plans. When a colleague tried to convince her to participate in gossip about another teacher, the clock remained utterly silent, its disapproval clear in the absence of sound. Word spread through the neighborhood about the magical clock that only chimed for kind hearts. People began visiting Elena's apartment not to see the clock itself, but to discover whether it would chime in their presence. The clock became an honest mirror of people's intentions and actions, showing them truths about themselves that they might have been avoiding. A wealthy businessman came to test the clock, confident that his generous charitable donations would make it sing. But the clock remained silent, revealing that his giving was motivated more by tax benefits and public recognition than genuine concern for others. Instead of becoming defensive, the man sat quietly with this revelation and began asking Elena questions about what real kindness looked like. The clock didn't chime during that visit, but it did so weeks later when the man returned to tell Elena that he had started volunteering anonymously at a homeless shelter. A teenager who was known as a troublemaker at Elena's school came to her apartment expecting the clock to confirm everyone's negative opinion of him. To his shock, the clock chimed softly but clearly. Elena explained that the clock had detected something he didn't see in himself. Beneath his defensive behavior was a person who helped his younger siblings with homework every night, who rescued stray animals, and who stood up for classmates who were being bullied, even when it cost him socially. The clock taught Elena and everyone who encountered it that kindness existed in infinite variations and expressions. It chimed for the exhausted single mother who got up every night to comfort her crying baby, recognizing the kindness of patient parenting. It sang for the janitor who picked up litter in the park each morning without being asked, honoring the kindness of caring for shared spaces. It resonated with the elderly man who called his lonely neighbor every day just to chat, celebrating the kindness of consistent companionship. But the clock also remained silent in moments that taught important lessons. It didn't chime when people performed kind acts while simultaneously judging others for not doing the same. It stayed quiet when someone's helpfulness was really about controlling or manipulating others. It offered no sound when kindness was selective, given only to people who could offer something in return. Elena learned that the clock's greatest gift wasn't validation but truth. It showed people the difference between kindness that came from the ego's need to be seen as good, and kindness that flowed naturally from a heart that genuinely cared about others' well-being. The clock became a teacher of authenticity, helping people align their internal intentions with their external actions. As months passed, Elena's small apartment became an unofficial sanctuary for people seeking to understand and develop genuine kindness. She created a practice of inviting people to sit quietly near the clock, listening not just for its chimes but for the whispers of their own hearts, learning to recognize the difference between performative goodness and authentic compassion. The most beautiful transformation happened in Elena's school. Students who had visited her apartment and experienced the clock's wisdom began creating what they called kindness ripples, small, anonymous acts of generosity that spread through the school like gentle waves. The clock had taught them that real kindness didn't need recognition or reward, it was its own reward, creating a feeling of connection and purpose that no amount of praise could match. Elena discovered that the clock was teaching her as much as anyone else. On days when she felt frustrated with difficult students or overwhelmed by the challenges of teaching, the clock would remain silent until she reconnected with her genuine love for the work and the children. It helped her distinguish between patient endurance, which came from duty, and patient kindness, which came from love. The grandfather clock never became famous or valuable in monetary terms. It remained in Elena's modest apartment, chiming its celestial melodies for the people who genuinely needed its wisdom and remaining respectfully silent for those who weren't yet ready to hear its truths. Through its presence, countless people learned that kindness was not a trait you either possessed or lacked, but a practice you could develop through consistent, authentic attention to the well-being of others. Years later, when Elena was herself an elderly woman, she understood that the clock had been preparing her for its most important lesson. As she grew older and her capacity for grand gestures diminished, the clock continued chiming just as warmly for her small kindnesses, the smile she offered to the grocery clerk, the patience she practiced with her own forgetfulness, the gentle way she treated herself on difficult days. The clock was teaching her that kindness to oneself was as important as kindness to others, and that the gentleness you practiced toward your own imperfections was what allowed you to offer genuine compassion to everyone else. The grandfather clock that chimed only for kind hearts became a legacy that would outlive its creator, its owners, and everyone who encountered it, because its real gift wasn't the sound of its chimes but the awareness it awakened in human hearts, the understanding that kindness was always possible, always meaningful, and always enough.